This episode is brought to you by Trident Coffee, the veteran-owned brand where every sip inspires you to live life full steam ahead. At Trident, they are more than just coffee. They are storytellers. It's crafted by veterans. Their instant cold brew is perfect for those who serve, those who have served, and anyone who values wellness. Featuring natural ingredients like organic mushrooms, adaptogens, and nootropics, it's more than just a morning pick-me-up. It's your new wellness ritual. Enjoy it at home or on the go, wherever your day takes you. Trident Coffee isn't just about great tasting coffee. It's about empowering you to be the healthiest version of yourself, because great veterans make great citizens. Try their instant cold brew coffee today and taste the freedom of wellness. Remember, when you choose Trident, you're not just choosing coffee. You're choosing a path of connection through health and wellness. Use promo code DTD15 for 15% off your order. In 3, 2, 1, and we're live. Hey guys, welcome back to Dynamic Tales Delivered podcast, where we delve into the intricate web of human experiences. Today, we're honored to have a conversation with a distinguished clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Hawaii-Hilo as our guest. With over 30 years of professional experience working with military veterans and active duty personnel, his insights and research have shaped our understanding of the complexities surrounding the operator syndrome. Join us as we explore his groundbreaking work that is revolutionizing the way we approach and treat multifaceted challenges faced by those in the military special operations and first responders. From his extensive research to his involvement in various foundations and collaborations dedicated to supporting the military community, Dr. FRUEH's impact is truly profound. Through his numerous publications, testimonies before Congress, and contributions to prestigious publications, his expertise has reached far and wide, influencing discussions on mental health, military operations, and societal issues. Let's also not forget his captivating historical crime novels under his pen name, Christopher Bartley, offering a glimpse into America's past through gripping narrative of men with guns searching for meaning and connection. Please welcome into the studio, Dr. Chris FRUEH. Welcome, my friend.
Wow. Thank you for that gracious introduction. I hope I can live up to it, DJ.
Oh, I know you can. So, you're in Hawaii. How's it going there right now?
Just living the dream here. There's something nice about just kind of being off the beaten path a little bit.
Yeah, I got to understand how you pick such a horrible place to live and teach.
Well, that conversation could fill up the entire the entire show today. I'll just give you the short version. My wife and I had our midlife crisis at the same time together, and it felt like I needed to leave the VA and needed a break from academic medicine. So we popped over to the Big Island, and we've been here for 18 years now, which who knew that was going to happen? But also part of the way, I think for me at least, how that worked was, after being here for a couple of years, I got recruited away to Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, which turned into only a 6-month job before I came back to the University of Hawaii. But that turned into a part-time job that lasted about a decade. So Houston has been my second home and maybe my lifeline to civilization.
You got a favorite part of Hawaii? I know mine was like the spam musubi and the pork manapua and, all of the bento boxes and stuff. And of course the beaches. You got a favorite part of Hawaii?
My home. We live out in the rainforest area out in the country, and it's just a very peaceful, quiet, beautiful place.
Nice. I can't imagine a better place to have a midlife crisis to go to and relax. It was great when we lived there. My wife and I lived there for 4 years, and it was fantastic. I do want to point out something that you mentioned there, that you kind of had your midlife crisis together and you moved. You thought it was your time to step away from the VA. Now, you haven't always been focused on research, always been focused on this stuff. You were, at a certain point, you were actually sitting down and talking to people and actually having a practice. Is that correct?
Well, sure. Yes. The first 7 years of my career, I was a full-time clinician therapist at the VA in Charleston, South Carolina, and faculty at the Medical University of South Carolina. And then I started getting research grants. to study mental health issues in veterans. And that shifted my time. But for the next 8 years, while I was working those grants, I maintained a 25% of my time on doing clinical work with veterans. And then probably from 2006 till about 2014, I didn't really do any clinical work at all. But the past decade, I won't call it clinical work, but the past decade, I've done quite a bit of one-on-one work with individual operators, spouses, first responders, private defense contractors. So I'm not a researcher who, a lot of researchers saw their last patient, 20 years ago. I'm not that guy. I had a really good mentor early in my career after getting out of school, a gentleman named Sam Turner and his work partner, Debbie Beidel. And they both they were world-class researchers, very famous, but they both instilled in me that to do meaningful clinical research, you have to know your patients. You have to be a clinician yourself. You can't be removed from the people you think you're trying to understand. And so that's always kind of been my approach to everything I do.
Well, and it's interesting to me. So, what years are we talking about when you get out of school? Because I want to kind of understand this evolution of your life and your career. You start out to be a therapist, to talk to people, and then you get involved in the VA. And then this is before 9/11 has happened, correct? You're already working at the VA before 9/11 happens.
Correct. I did my final year of training in 1991 at the VA, and then in 1992 I received my PhD, and then that was the start of my career, 1992. So I was VA from 92 to 2006.
Right. And those are we talk about it on the show a lot. Those are two very different times in the military.
Yeah.
You're talking about a strictly peacetime. Guys aren't deploying really a lot. The special operations community is still deploying, but definitely not as much as they did post 9/11. And so you're seeing, I think, a different kind of mental health. You're seeing a different kind of counseling and therapy that's going through then 9/11 happens, you switch over, and then you go to almost specifically special operations as you start moving down the road. So can we start kind of how you started your career, what you were thinking about when you did that, how that first part of 92 through 2001, how that's affecting you, how you're seeing the military, and then post 9/11, how you're seeing it?
Yeah, sure. So just to be clear, I've never served in the military. My father was a Vietnam veteran. He was a physician in the Air Force. So I grew up, in the 70s as a teenager with the specter of the Vietnam War kind of hanging over my family. Knew a lot of Vietnam veterans, knew Vietnamese people who lived in Columbia, Missouri, where I was growing up, who had immigrated or come over during the war. One of my favorite babysitters was when I was like 10, 11, was a Vietnamese man who my father had been helping with his studies. He was working on a dissertation, and my father was helping him with the writing of it. And in return, he did some babysitting. And his name was Mr. Long to us. I don't know his first name, but he went home shortly before the fall of Saigon. He went home to collect his wife and his child or children, and he was picked up by the North Vietnamese and executed. Probably because he had a PhD, and maybe they didn't even know that. Maybe it was just because he wore glasses. But he was murdered by the government, and that affected us as kids, in the house when we learned about that. When I went to, and then I had a great grandfather who I adored, who lived to a very old age. He died when I was 14, and he was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. So he fought at San Juan Hill in Cuba, 1898. I went to graduate school, started in 1987. I wanted to work with veterans, and that was my career goal. My thoughts didn't involve teaching, didn't involve research. It was pure clinical work. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I was aiming for. So everything that happened apart from that was mostly just kind of happy accidents. In the 90s, when I was at the VA, the patients were say about 80% Vietnam veterans. So that was the group I worked directly with the most. But at that time, we still had patients who were World War II and Korean veterans. We had a small handful of veterans from the first Persian Gulf War at that time, just a small number. The World War II veterans, I really enjoyed working with them. They were just amazing people. Through my next door neighbor, just happenstance, pure coincidence, I learned my next door neighbor at one point was not only a World War II veteran, but he had been a POW in Germany. He'd been shot down. He had been a bombardier and was shot down over Europe and spent 2 years in a POW camp. So through him, I got involved in working with the local chapter of the POW organization, a national organization. And that group was almost entirely World War II POWs. There was one Korean POW. There were no Vietnam POWs, but I got involved with the Vietnam POWs a couple years later, circa 2000, I'm going to say. And another group of just incredible men to have the honor to know and to work with. So by the time I left in 2006, by the time I left the VA, we were just starting, to get the trickle of OIF, OEF veterans coming into the VA. And kind of one thing I saw that was rather astonishing was in my 15 years there at the VA, the PTSD clinic that I was in, we were the same group of people. And we were a very small clinic. We had one psychologist, me, we had one social worker and one psychiatrist. And it was the three of us worked together for 15 years without any churn among us, which is kind of remarkable. But we were a small clinic, 3 clinicians. I left. In the process of leaving, I persuaded some of my colleagues in Charleston to come over and take my role. One colleague in particular to come over and take my role, and then he brought some other people over. And within 3 or 4 years of leaving, that clinic that had 3 clinicians had about 15 or 20 clinicians. So as the war on terror, as the GWAT moved along, the VA mental health programs they blew up. They became huge in a way that I couldn't have imagined while I was working there.
Well, the first question would be, when you're talking to this World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, that's how you start your career. Mm-hmm. That generation, or I guess those generations, because that would be 2 different ones, they don't talk a lot. That was the big thing about World War II, is they don't talk about what bothered them. That was the big thing about Korea. Vietnam, they started to open up a little more. So I want to try and get in your head and understand, as you're talking to these guys, it's going to be a different kind of conversation than you're going to have with these guys later on in life. Yep. So how do you get through to someone from World War II to Korea to really open up and let you inside of, what they're thinking when they're not those kind of people?
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. Different time and place. I mean, just an incredible cohort effect for the greatest generation and who they were, how they functioned, and then the generations that came after them. And of course, the wars were different. Society was different. The demands that were placed on soldiers in the war was different, and the reception home when they came home was also very different, as you know. I would characterize virtually all of the World War II and Korean veterans I knew as very stoic men, very stoic. They'd done their duty. They'd come home. They said to themselves, let's put the war behind us and go forward. And we saw the greatest economic, I'll call it a miracle, the greatest economic miracle in the history of mankind developed in the 50s and 60s into the 70s, as due to the work ethic and the opportunities, and of course just sort of the global realities of that period. But once you started talking to them, what you realized was I'm I'm going to just in my own head think of one very specific patient I had who was just an incredible man. He'd fought in the Pacific with the U.S. Marine Corps. He had been a part of the invasion of several of the islands. And he had the mindset as a Marine that he and all of his teammates were almost certainly going to be killed in action, that they weren't coming home. And he described that they resolved themselves to that. So they fought these horrendous battles against a tenacious, determined enemy. There really were no rules to the war on those islands. Anything, everything went. The casualty rates were staggering on both sides, but usually ended with the Japanese defenders being almost completely wiped out. And some of the battles killed almost virtually to the last man on some of those islands. And then he comes home and he's living in rural South Carolina on a farm. And he married his high school sweetheart, and he had a small business, and he had a small farm. And over the years, through all those decades after the war, how did he cope? What did he do? What he described to me was his nightly routine after work. He worked hard. He would come home. He would be, tired from physical labor, and he would get he wasn't a drinker. He would get an iced tea and some cold drinks and a pitcher of it. He would just sit on his porch and just listen to the quiet in the evenings. He didn't want to talk to anybody. He didn't want to listen to anything. He read the Bible. I think he read a few other things, but he did not talk. His wife had no idea what he'd been, what he'd done, what he'd seen. No idea. And it's possible that I'm one of the few people he ever talked to about it. It's probable, other than maybe some friends of his who'd been there. And he would sit in my office. But of course, the other piece of it is at this time you have to realize how old he was. He was probably, I'm trying to think back, he was probably early 80s, at least late 70s when I met him, into his 80s. So health problems, mobility issues. And he would tell me his experiences and he would cry. And he would tell me he answered every question I asked. And frequently I would just say, tell me about this. And I wouldn't say another word for the rest of the hour, and he would talk. He usually would weep a little bit. And then he'd wipe his eyes at the end of the session and he'd leave, and then he'd come back, a week or two later. He couldn't come down every week because he lived, like 90 minutes away from the hospital. Maybe it was farther than that. That's pretty typical. My next door neighbor, who had been a POW for 2 years, here's my next door neighbor. I knew him. I knew his wife. They were friends. We had them over for dinner, or they had us over for dinner. In public, he never talked about his service. Never, in front of my wife, that was not we just didn't talk about it. He'd had a very effective, successful career as mid-management in manufacturing somewhere in Pennsylvania. Then he'd moved to South Carolina, I think after he retired. But he'd been a good husband, a good father. He'd been a good earner and producer. But he never talked about the war. His wife would also talk to me, and she would tell me about his nightmares, about his anger, about his how he isolated himself. They did things like they went to church, but he would tell me privately he just went to because it pleased her and she wanted him to go. Well, did you get some comfort from it? He would say, yeah, I did, but it wasn't necessarily top on his list if he didn't have his wife there. But the bond between them was incredibly strong, and she was so protective of him, very protective of him.
I've got so many questions from just that little bit right there. Let's first go back to the World War II veteran. He tells you that he works hard every day. Then he gets his iced tea, he sits, and he just listens to the silence. He doesn't talk to anybody. Of course, he probably had a pretty good relationship with his wife, but I want to kind of drill down into the psychology of this. Mm-hmm. I want to first ask the question, do you think he worked so hard because that was his way to shut all those thoughts out that he was telling you about. That was his way to work through it or compartmentalize it, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
was his way of keeping his mind busy all day. That would be the first question.
Well, I'm going to answer that with 3 points. One, yes, he did, and he compartmentalized it, and the work was very important to him. That is how he survived. I have no doubt of that. 2, he had to work hard because that's what it took to survive in those years. I mean, there wasn't the social safety nets that we have now. The VA was not providing disability at the level and the rate that it does now. So you worked because that was the expectation. All of society expected the man to work and to earn. And his wife, had bore the children and raised the children and took care of the household. So she obviously she worked too, just in a different way. The third thing I would say is we've done a catastrophic thing to modern veterans. I mean, I consider it to be tragic, and it's a whole of society tragedy when we tell our veterans, hey, you're disabled and here's your disability, you don't need to work. Now, I know most veterans do work, thankfully. Work is so important. Work is your mission, it's your purpose, it's your reason to get out of bed in the morning. And the folks that take the VA, in some ways, the VA says to veterans, all of our veterans, stay home, you're disabled, we're going to send you money, you don't need to work. I don't mean that literally, and I know most veterans do work, but work is so important for all of us. And, I would say especially for men, especially for men of a certain type. How do you take a hard-charging, smart, brave, courageous, physically fit, rugged, problem-solving man with a certain hardness to him and then plant him on a couch? Without a mission and purpose, that's the end of that man, and it's tragic.
I guess I got to first kind of preface the rest of our conversation with, I want to talk about, you said the VA tells you it's an injury, you can't go to work, sit at home, all those kind of things. And there's been a lot of discussion. Is it PTSD? Is it PTSI? Is it PTS? I want to understand from your level of what it is and how we kind of approach this, because I think with so many different ways to say it, with so many people thinking different thoughts about what it is, I think that leads to some of the trouble that we have with
For sure.
not only diagnosing this, but moving past it.
For sure. If we can't even agree on what it is, how do we understand it? How do we treat it? How do we move past it? You're right on the money there. So what do I think it is? Well, I address this very directly in my book, the Operator Syndrome book. I'm not going to say PTSD is not part of the problem, but I will say I think the VA and the field of mental health, primarily psychiatry and psychology, clinical psychology, have turned PTSD into an easy button. So a soldier comes in, a veteran comes into a clinic, says, I'm having problems with anger, I'm drinking too much, I'm not sleeping well, I feel kind of depressed and down. That big red easy button is awfully easy to hit. Boom, there's PTSD. We're gonna identify that as a so-called disability, and we've just sent a message to our veteran by calling it a disability. We've told that veteran that they're damaged goods, they're broken. We've set an unfortunate expectation, and society has bought into this wholeheartedly. That PTSD is this disorder that pretty much every veteran who deployed gets, and they don't recover from it. It's a lifelong condition. I got to push back on that. I don't think the data really support that in the least. I think we've missed the boat on what the real problems are, and they're not simple. And that's part of the issue. It's not a simple problem. It's not one thing. So, we'll get into talking about this I think in a few minutes when we talk about operator syndrome or we talk about responder syndrome, but it's physiological. And our current understandings of PTSD don't acknowledge that. So I'll just talk about operator syndrome. PTSD is a small part of it. I'll grant that. But primarily, what is it? It's traumatic brain injury, so physiological injuries to the brain and the nervous system. It's sleep apnea. 80 to 90% of the operators I know have sleep apnea. Common in firefighters. It's common in combatants of all types, not just operators. It's common in law enforcement officers. Then we see endocrine dysfunction. We're not even testing for hormones in most cases. But guess what? For a man who has low testosterone, and almost every guy I know does, almost every guy I work with does have low testosterone. It's the norm, not the exception. That man with low T is going to look like he's depressed. He's going to be tired. He's going to be low. He's going to have low motivation. He's irritable. He's not sleeping well. He's probably coping by drinking more than he should. Yes, he's having trouble with his body, muscle mass and his libido and his, sexual functioning. But as much as anything, he's going to just seem down and out, and he's not going to know what's wrong with him. And the shame of this is if that veteran or that responder goes into a medical clinic, whether it's the VA or a private clinic, almost certainly going to be tagged with a psychiatric diagnosis, while the hormonal dysregulation is never even thought of or checked, not even tested for. The sleep disruption, the chronic pain, the cognitive impairments from the traumatic brain injury are usually ignored. It's sort of like we've created an avatar, a little emoji. Oh, here's the time for the PTSD avatar. Let's pull that out of the box. And what is the treatment for? What is the acknowledged treatment for that currently? Well, it's
A bucket full of pills.
a bucket full of pills. You took the words right out of my mouth. And therapy with a well-meaning, usually a very well-meaning therapist. But that therapist, in today's society, therapists they don't know anything about the history of the GWAT for the most part. They don't know what soldiers did in the war. They don't have an understanding of the military culture. You carry that over to first responder roles. Again, same problem. They don't understand the culture. They don't know what it really means. I mean, we've all watched TV, we've all watched movies, so we have these ideas that are for the most part are wrong. And there's very little understanding of when it comes to a veteran of what the MOS meant. Depending on what your MOS, depending on what kind of unit, depending on what branch, depending on where you were and when you were there, entirely different concerns are possible. And I just don't see it. I just don't see the understanding or the awareness. In fact, a good friend of mine who is a VA psychologist now, some years ago, he was at MARSOC. He was a Marine, multiple combat deployments, and then he went into one of the tier units and was operating in some very austere environments on parts of the map that most Americans don't even think about. And now he's working in the VA, and his experience for him is just mind-blowing. He's, almost once a week, maybe more often, he sends me something, some official announcement or some information on the latest thing that they have to attend and learn. There's a lot of webinars, a lot of educational things that they have to check off. A lot of that, most of it now, has nothing to do with combat or military culture. They're learning all about LGBTQ trauma and racial trauma and other things along the DEI checklist. And I'm not in the least denigrating the trauma of
Absolutely.
marginalized groups. Not at all. It's just that's just not a primary, shouldn't be a primary focus for the VA. It's not a primary need for the vast majority of of veterans. So I see the VA has become this bizarro sheltered workshop for federal employees who have degrees in medicine, nursing, psychology, social work, other allied health disciplines. Most of them aren't really there to treat combat veterans anymore. That's my impression. That's the impression I have formed just from talking to so many people.
Okay, so let me kind of put you in the frying pan for just a minute, because you were part of that organization for a very long time. We can agree on that.
Yep, yep.
What has been said, what has been discussed and stuff is that when you said a bucket full of pills, that's what a lot of people get from the VA. They go in, they're processing so many that it's like an assembly line. They're just trying to get them through and get them out. Now,
Yeah.
some veterans get very angry about that. Some say they're just given and they're just doing with the tools what they're given. That's all they can do. So
Yeah.
I got to ask you, with you being there on the ground and seeing it before this really rise up after post 9/11, do you feel the same way, that it's just kind of a factory line and we're just trying to get people through? And it may not necessarily be that doctor's fault. It may not necessarily be that nurse's fault. They're just doing what they can do, or can they be better at their jobs?
Yeah. Probably all of the above. Now, what I've seen, now, again, preface this, I'm not a VA employee. I haven't worked for the
Of
VA since
course.
2006. I have very little contact with VA clinicians. Most of what I know from about the VA is secondhand. It comes from hearing the experiences of veterans or of the experience of colleagues of mine who work in the VA. One thing we can say is I think the medication forward has always been a problem in the VA. When I started at the VA in 1992, we had a psychiatrist. Actually, we had two psychiatrists. So one of the psychiatrists was not around for the whole 15 years because he was forced out by the other MDs after a while, which is the good news. But he was prescribing, his idea of treating PTSD in a veteran was to prescribe north of 80 milligrams a day of Valium. That was a fairly
Wow.
standard, right? I mean, that'll put an elephant to sleep. And he was well intentioned. I want to say that he was well intentioned. He worked hard, long hours. He went the extra mile to spend time with.
But can I
with
interrupt you there? I got to ask you a question, because it's always the thing that pops in my head. And I don't know, because I've never been one, but you say he was well intentioned. But I almost feel like in the law enforcement career, first responder career, military career, you can get to a point where you're just so burned out. Your blade is so dull
Yeah,
that I don't even know if it's well intentioned anymore. It's, let me just get through this so I can get to that finish line.
I think he believed in what he was doing. He believed it was good care. He really did, and I want to credit him with that. But he was also incredibly naive. He didn't know that his patients didn't need all that Valium, so they were selling half of it on the street. He couldn't wrap his mind around that. We had patients that would come in for appointments and they would just be zombies practically. When sometimes patients came onto the inpatient unit where they were actually administered their full prescribed dose of Valium, they would be unconscious for until you woke them up and dialed that way back. It did take in this one case, the doctors worked together as a unit to pull him out of there. And they basically, his own peers said, you can't do this, and we're not going to let you do it. And so he eventually moved and took another job somewhere else, probably another VA, I don't know. But that didn't entirely change the reality that patients were being given a lot of medications, including antipsychotic medications, which have horrendous side effects. Even if they dampen down some of the nightmares and some of the anxiety, they cause weight gain, they cause metabolic syndrome. So as early as from the very beginning of my time in the VA, I saw patients being way over medicated, and that was a real concern. Now, today, I think it's gotten worse. I routinely hear guys saying, my prescribers at the VA have given me 10 pills, 10 different medications, 15, 20. I was sitting at a table in Houston a few years ago with one of the foundations, one of the veteran foundations run by veterans. And they went around the table and they each said kind of what their peak number of prescribed medications from the VA was. And it was 18, 20, 22, 15. And to a man, and they were all men, they had gotten better by getting off of the medications. That's what it took to kind of get out of that, out of just a horrible fog state. When I worked at the VA in the 90s, we didn't have a waiting list. If a veteran needed treatment, I mean, it might be, we'll schedule you for next week or sometimes maybe 2 weeks out, but we saw people pretty much as soon as they needed to be seen. We did a thorough team-based evaluation, not just a 5-minute check the box conversation, which is sometimes what I hear guys saying. We worked as a team. So our patient would come in and I would do my part of the evaluation. Social worker would do a part. The psychiatrist would do an interview, and then we had questionnaires, and then we would get together and we would have a meeting and we would develop whatever the treatment plan needed to be. And then we would give feedback to that patient. But it was done in a relatively timely manner. What I hear now is VA clinicians are scheduled 6 months out, a year out, maybe even more than that, which, I don't think we can blame the clinicians for that. And that's just a total clusterfuck. I don't know what you do with that. That I don't even know how to understand that. I don't know why that problem exists, but I hear that pretty consistently.
When we're talking about all of these kind of things with the prescriptions, what I've heard on this show, and a lot of guys have told me, was how it gets out of control is they're prescribed something to take their anxiety down. And then the doctor sees, okay, well, I'm getting this now. My stomach hurts. Okay, well, take this and then your stomach won't hurt, but take this to take your anxiety away. And then they say, okay, well, that constipates me. And they say, okay, well, take this to take the constipation away, and take this to take your stomach ache away, and then take this. Yep. And it just gets into an OODA loop that can't be fixed because they just continue to stack and stack and stack.
Right.
So the question to that would be is you're talking about this 3-person team that you had. You had a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and a social worker. 0 to 100, how important is putting an endocrinologist in there?
Very important. Today, I would say it should absolutely be routine practice. Every veteran, male or female, has a full hormonal panel conducted before they're prescribed any psychiatric medications. I would make that SOP if I was king of the VA. We didn't do that in the 90s. So I'm talking now about things I understand now that I didn't understand in the 90s. And I'll say this about my field, the field of mental health. I've been in part of 3 different psychiatry departments: Baylor College of Medicine, University of Texas, Houston, and the University of South Carolina. And they were all good departments of psychiatry. For listeners, psychiatry departments are relatively large departments that are multidisciplinary. So they're not all psychiatrists. I was a psychologist in one. So we had psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. Oftentimes you have geneticists, neuroimagers, anthropologists sometimes. They're large departments. So at any given time, you might have 120, 150 different faculty members. If I calculate in all the churn, I can't figure out an exact number, but I've probably had, 500 to 700 colleagues over the years in the 3 different psychiatry departments I was a part of. Not one of them ever had a urologist or an endocrinologist as a faculty member in the department.
When did that become very forefront? Because you talk about it a lot in the book. You talk about having all those other pieces of the puzzle. So I'm wondering, and I'm asking you, just in your career, when did you have that aha moment where you're like, holy shit, we need to have way more than we have right now?
Yes. Probably about 9 or 10 years ago. The first operator I ever had the privilege to talk to was somebody who was a friend. So this was a very informal conversation, as a huge percentage of my conversations and work with operators have been. And I thought I was going to be able to help this gentleman. Navy SEAL, relatively fresh out of DevGru. He, very accomplished career, late 30s. And pretty much his opening complaint to the world was, I don't feel right. I don't feel like myself. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I don't recognize myself, literally or figuratively. I look in the mirror and I don't even, like, the face looks different. And now I'm out, I'm living, I should be doing well, but going to the gym sucks. I don't want to do it. I don't have much sex drive. Yeah, I have a beautiful girlfriend, but just like getting it up and being interested is just hard. I don't know what's wrong with me. So I started the conversation with some wrong assumptions that this was depression and PTSD. And to my surprise, when I realized it was something else and I didn't know what it was, then it was a trial and error. Let's get some testing done. We did a sleep study. We got a hormone panel. We got a metabolic panel. Everything in every system was jacked up. Guy had the testosterone. Here's this hulk of a man who's 37 years old, and he's got the testosterone of an 8-year-old. And he has sleep apnea, which didn't make sense to me either. Why would you have sleep apnea? You're not an elderly, overweight man. That's a disorder you get 40 years down the line, not now, not at age 37. And so once we started getting those dialed in, he did a lot better, like almost immediately. We got him to a urologist, and I want to say this very clearly. Having low testosterone does not mean that you should or need to receive testosterone replacement therapy. There are other interventions that often make more sense than that. But in his case, his testosterone was so low, and there were some other issues going on around it, elevated estrogen, that he needed medication for this. And when his hormones got more in the range that you'd want to see them in, he became a very different person. And there was still anxiety. There was still sadness. There was still, issues with drinking too much and anger. But he was able to stop drinking pretty much completely once he started sleeping better and once he got his testosterone dialed in. And after that, I would say most of our conversations were around the existential issues of his service career, whatever we want to call that: moral injury, guilt, shame, confusion, challenge of the transition into the civilian world. But that to me was my aha moment. That was about 10 years ago. And ever since then, well, maybe not immediately, but that became an early question I would ask guys. Hey, have you had these tests run? No? Well, let's go do them. Let's go get them done. Now it's every single operator I work with, every responder I work with or talk to. These are issues.
I got to ask you, though, in saying that just 9 or 10 years ago is when you had this aha moment, how often is ego getting in the way of us doing full and complete, not only research, but full and complete treatments, first responders, law enforcement, firefighters, ER personnel, military? How much is ego still getting in the way?
A lot. Medicine is arrogant. Care providers are arrogant, especially once they have 6 or 12 months of experience. They start to think that they have a lot of the answers. Your best therapists are the ones that come to their patients with humility and curiosity. And that's a vanishingly small group these days. There is the narrative of this is how we define the problem. This is how we treat the problem. And we don't deter from it. I'll share this with you. Yesterday, I received an email from a psychologist at a VA asking if I would if I could do give a talk to her PTSD clinic team members. I don't know how big the clinic is. And she was requesting a virtual presentation. And I said, absolutely, I'll be happy to do this. She said, what's your fee structure? And I said, for the VA, for a remote presentation, no fee. I wouldn't charge the VA for this. This is the first time anybody from the VA has ever reached out to me to have a conversation about operator syndrome, about operator health, about this framework.
But that's got to get to you to think, look, we're trying to lead this community in another direction. And the first time you got reached out to was yesterday.
Yesterday.
It,
What was that? July 17th, 2024.
right. And the whole thing about that is because I'm going to be very honest with you. I think we talk a lot about mental health awareness and taking care of our troops, and a big thing is morale in law enforcement, and it's bullshit. And I'm going to tell you that, and I've said it on this show a lot. It's bullshit. It's buzzwords, and it's something to check the blocks and to make people go, yeah, they're taking care of their people, when morale is at an all-time low, when people are leaving in droves, and we think, well, if we just do this, everything will be okay. And I'm not saying like a pizza party. We're not going to throw a pizza party, but it's little tiny nuggets of something.
Yeah.
Oh, that'll fix everything. And it's bullshit. And I'm just wondering how we bring people like you, people that are studying the same thing as you, to the attention of these people, the VA and them, and go, look, we're doing this wrong. We have to finally get rid of our hubris and say we're doing this wrong.
Correct. Yes, I'm with you 100%. I see it too. Almost everything that we have to do something. So what do? We do something quick and stupid that it makes for a good soundbite. And we're almost always doing it in a way that's completely tone deaf. And if the people that are running these committees, these task forces to solve veteran suicide, if they would just talk to some actual veterans, maybe some common sense. One thing that really kind of skins my ass is this idea that, oh, we have a suicide problem in veterans and responders. Therefore, the solution is to do something with their guns, put gun locks on their guns, take away their guns, make it harder for them to shoot themselves. That'll solve our problem. And it's like, you know what? What you do with that's garbage. That all that does is it ensures people aren't going to tell you if they're suicidal, because they ain't going to give up their guns. And I now talked with a lot of people who one of their questions with me is, doc, if I pursue these treatments, is the government going to take away my guns? And my answer is, not yet, not so far, but it's a tone deaf approach. And let me give a specific example. My friends at the National Centers for PTSD through the VA. This is a network of centers that got set up, I think, in the 80s. It was there when I started my career. It already existed. I believe it was set up in the 80s. And it was congressionally funded. So it was Congress saying, we have a problem with PTSD and veterans, and we don't know what to do about it. So we're going to establish this network of centers of excellence for PTSD. There's one in Boston. There's one in New Hampshire. There's one in Palo Alto. There had been one in Honolulu. There's 7 or 8 of them. They're all affiliated with, Yale, Dartmouth, Boston University, top-notch universities. They have line item funding, so they have they're under no pressure to generate their own funding. They have line items, guaranteed job security. They can apply for grants, and they run the whole narrative for the VA. So now what you have 50 years later, is it 50? It's 40 years later. Let's call it 40 years later. You have the same fucking people who have been running these centers now. I mean, literally, you got people who are pushing 80 who are still in the chair, and they're doing the exact same crap they were doing in the 1980s. I can't fault what they were doing in the 80s or 90s, but they refused to make any course correction. And now we have this problem with suicide, and we have this problem with what we call PTSD. Veterans are suffering, and they're not getting helped. They haven't moved the needle. They have not moved the needle, and like, I think we're almost waiting for this this cohort of so-called medical clinical research leaders to age out or die off before we'll have another generation that may be able to make changes, except that they've, the next generation coming behind them is now in their 50s and 60s, and they've been steeped in this whole, the whole narrative of what they're doing. So are they going to make changes? I don't know. I don't think so. But then you have another issue, which is we can talk about arrogance, we can talk about ignorance, but we also have to talk about vested interest. Who has the power? Who has the empires? Are they going to relinquish? Are they going to relinquish that? And I'll tell you what they do. They go after any voice like mine. They go after, a young psychologist, in the VA, a few years into the VA, they're going to be told, shut your mouth. We don't do it. We don't talk about hormones. We don't do it that way. Shut up, do it the way we've always done it, or your career is going to be in trouble. And I'm not exaggerating. I was told this myself in 2005 when I was doing some research showing that the VA had a problem with people coming in the doors claiming they were decorated combatants, and they weren't. They were not. They'd never been in combat. So there is a problem of overrepresenting of military bona fides and a problem of symptom exaggeration in order to get disability funding. And the VA, that was not okay. I was called by a mentor of mine who I respected and thought was at least somebody I could trust. And he said, your career, and he was holding a paper I had submitted for publication. I don't know how he got it, but he said, if you publish this paper, it's really going to hurt your career. So you probably don't want to do it. Try to bully me into not publishing the paper.
Yeah. And that's the point that I'm getting to. So you talk about these 80-year-olds that are still in the chair. And then this next generation's, it's 50, 60-year-olds. And then I guess we could jump to 30s and 40s, the next generation after that. But I pose this question to you. You say it might be this next generation, the 50-year-olds. But let's say it goes down to the 30, 40-year-olds. With that much time in between the 80-year-olds and the 30 and 40-year-olds, how fast do you actually think things are going to change? Even if they want to change them, there's so much red tape. There's so much stuff you have to go through to change things. So we're talking 3 generations down the road before anything happens. And we're 20 years removed from that, 25 years removed from that. There has to be something that can be done at a smaller level, I would think. Do you agree?
Yes, and it's all happening outside of the government.
But in the end, it's all going to go back to the government. Look at COVID. We locked down for a year. We didn't leave our houses. You and I talked about the colleges saying, don't come in. And then when it's over and everyone can go back, well, maybe you should, I hear what you're saying. It's outside the government, but it's all going to go back to that somewhere because there's got to be a regulation that comes in from somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I meant by that is where is the innovation happening and where are the real determined, thoughtful efforts happening? Mostly from foundations and private clinics that are being set up with with the right people and who are able to leverage philanthropic dollars and or business, private business approaches. But you've got a lot of foundations out here that are doing some amazing work and are helping people, but they're doing it by raising money philanthropy. It's not, and to your point, that's not enough. That's not enough. So for you and me, we're having this conversation, and if you were to, if you were somebody who said to me, Doc, let's talk and help me out a little bit here. I want to get some ideas. Some of the ideas I would be saying to you that are things to at least explore or consider are obviously the hormones, the sleep study. What are some of the treatments for anxiety? Well, I'm not going to recommend Valium for sure. I'm not going to recommend a lot of the medications that the VA might push. I will recommend stellate ganglion block therapy. That's a direct, short medical procedure, outpatient, safe, effective. We've been using it to treat headaches for 100 years. And now we know that it almost immediately, like within 12 to 24 hours, has a powerful effect on reducing the sympathetic nervous system at hyperarousal. So, You get the shot, you're going to sleep better, you're going to relax better, you're going to be less angry, less anxious, you're going to be less of an asshole. Your dogs are going to like you again. Your children, your grandchildren are going to have a new appreciation for you. Does the VA provide this treatment? Nah.
No.
Maybe in a few clinics, but not as a matter of course. Ketamine infusion, are they providing that? Nah, they're not. Are they providing transcranial magnetic stimulation as a routine treatment that any veteran or responder can get? No, they're not. What about psychedelics? Nope. What about hyperbaric oxygen therapy? Nope. And the VA will, the VA and people in medicine will say, well, these are not treatments that we know about or have been fully tested. And there's some validity to that. For psychedelics, they haven't been fully tested. For hyperbaric oxygen therapy, that's a question that has not fully been settled yet. But I guess what? Within the last 2 years, the Israelis have been publishing clinical trials showing profound benefits to many of the cluster of emotional and brain issues that we're seeing routinely in combatants and responders.
Okay. We can dive into this too, because you brought up the ketamine stuff. I wanted to get into that a little later, but since you're talking about it right now, let's go into this. When you talk about a ketamine treatment, when you talk about the psychedelics, the ayahuasca treatments, there's a plenitude of ones out there. Stellate ganglion block, you have the Stellate Institute, you have a couple different things. Law enforcement and first responders, ketamine is out. Ayahuasca is out. Stellate, yeah, you could do that. The other ones are very expensive treatments. So we run into a couple different things.
100%.
And let me lay those out to you. You run into a couple different problems. Let's start with the first one. As I pointed out, ayahuasca, ketamine, all of those treatments, they're out for first responders. They're out for medical personnel just because of the drug testing.
Okay, so hold there. Hold there. They're out, but they don't have to be out. That's a choice that we've made.
Oh, okay. So let's go back into that. We just talked about that there is a regulation in there, whether that comes from the government, whether it's local, national, whatever it is. That is, I can tell you, I'm 100% positive that is not going to change for years to come.
I agree. I'm just saying that that's a choice. I totally agree with you. That's not going to change.
Absolutely.
But it is a choice.
When you get into ones that are treatments, the stellate ganglion block, let's talk about that one. You're talking about possibly a $5,000 treatment to do it.
No, it's more like $1,500.
Well, let's say you do.
Let's say you
do both sides. We do dual-sided, or we have to do them where I think they're spacing them out now, like 6 months, a year, how they're spacing them out from getting. But it is something that you have to redo. Some of these guys don't have that kind of money. So they're out on the ayahuasca. They're out on the ketamine. They can't afford to do the stellate blocks.
Right. Yeah.
So we're dwindling down all of these avenues that we could take where we don't take a bunch of pills, where we don't do this. I'm just not seeing an answer to it, because I think everywhere you turn, and I got to know, it's super frustrating for firefighters, first responders, medical personnel. There's not really an answer out there. And I don't think anyone's looking for one right now.
Well, that's the point. No one's looking for that answer. And it's not on the responders to find those solutions. It's on the insurers and the establishment and the leadership of organizations to say, hey, we need this treatment. We need this service for our people. And we're going to get it. I mean, it's the only reason we're not doing it is we don't have the willpower or the leadership to do it.
So in your opinion, because this has been your area of expertise, why don't we have that? I guess I'm not understanding at that level when you're up that high. Once again, do we get into hubris? Do we get into ego? Do we get into what is it that's making them say, no, we're not doing this? That's not something we do. Just like you said about the VA. This episode brought to you by Max Belts. Guys, are you looking for a perfect accessory to wear every single day for every single scenario? Well, you've come to the right place. We all know that nothing stands up to wear and tear like a good leather belt. If you're looking for the toughest leather belt on earth, then you've come to the right place. Max Belts. They're handcrafted in the USA by veterans who are serious about their craft. And if you're looking for a belt that's tough enough for your active lifestyle and helps support those who've given so much to our country, look no further than Max Belts. It's the toughest belt on the planet. It's a perfect solution for casual or dress wear and ideal for utility and firearm carry. It's the highest caliber of American craftsmanship, and it also positively impacts our military charity partners. Once again, Max Belts, you can't go wrong with them. I wear them every day. They're the toughest belt on earth. And you can find all of this and so much more at maxbelts.com.
Well, our entire healthcare business model in the U.S. is completely FUBAR, I think. And where we've landed is we've landed with so much red tape, regulation. We no longer allow doctors to actually practice medicine. We tell them what they can do. They're restricted by their employers about what tests they can run, what medicines or treatments they even can prescribe. It's simple. It's as simple as, have you ever been told, sorry, I'd like to prescribe this medication for you, but it's not in our formulary? Or I'd like to recommend this treatment for you, the stellate ganglion treatment for you, but we don't have a mechanism to pay for it. It's one of ignorance, arrogance, and just a lack of willpower to be a little bit creative about how we solve problems.
Let's talk about one of your articles, Who Will Mount Up and Ride to the Sound of Guns? Your very first line out of that. The APA's latest manifesto is an embarrassment to the discipline of psychology. It's an abdication of scientific responsibility, denying biological evolutionary realities in favor of progressive fantasy pushed by social justice and feminist ideologies. You're taking on the APA. With that statement right there, you're not firing shots over the bow. You are taking death shots at them.
Yeah.
So when you do that, a lot of people say, because we're talking about people approving stuff, people approving treatments, when you take shots like that and people instantly get defensive and organizations instantly get defensive and people say, well, you can get more, flies with honey than you can with vinegar. How do we approach it and still get our flies, but let them know that you're being serious, because you're taking crazy shots at these people right off the bat?
Well, so maybe I'm too blunt to be effective in making the case for persuasion. The American Psychological Association it's not in receiving mode. And this is happening across the board in medicine, and my God, we can talk about it, but what we're seeing, the whole diversity, equity, inclusion movement, or cult, or whatever we want to call it, I prefer to call it a cult, assures us, it guarantees us that we are not putting our best foot forward in training or in delivery, in training providers or delivery of services. We're seeing this all across the board in America. And I think maybe the pendulum will start to swing back a little bit now. We saw something ridiculous a couple Saturdays ago. We saw a personal security detail that had individuals who were on the detail who weren't even tall enough to take the bullet. They were there because of some other reason. They didn't fit, they didn't fit the need. Medicine, let's talk about medicine. I'll talk about medical schools. And I used to, for 17 years, I was a consultant to the National Board of Medical Examiners. I did a lot of work for them over the years through their disability services. So if you were a medical student and you put in an application on the board exams and said, rather than taking the 8 hours to take this test like everybody else is taking it, I want 12 hours to take it, and I want to take it over 2 days instead of 1 day, and I want extra breaks. Because I have a psychiatric disorder, this is what I need. And they would submit their medical files and their reports and records and whatnot. And then it would come to me and I would review the file and I would make a recommendation to the national board. Well, about 4 years ago, I think it was 2020, January, I resigned from doing that. And they didn't care because they were no longer going to hold that line. The board exams used to be a very critical metric for determining residency. So medical students knew you had to do really well on these board exams, not just in order to get licensed, but in order to be competitive in residencies. And there's a very clear pecking order in residency programs. People who have the top scores, they go on to become surgeons. People who have the lowest scores go into psychiatry for the most part. Psychiatry is the bottom of the totem pole in medicine. Well, the reason they no longer cared about people gaming the system for disability accommodations was because the test went to pass-fail. They took away the percentile rankings. Now all you know of your resident applicant is whether they passed the test or didn't pass the test. You don't know where they scored, how they ranked in a percentile. Same thing with, doing away with standardizing tests like the SAT for undergraduate schools or the MCAT for medical school admissions. Across the board, we've watered down the standards so that we could say we have X percent of our student body in each of these demographic categories of race, gender, sexuality. The only way they could do that nationally across the board quickly was to remove the standards or to lower the standards or to hide the standards. It's the only way they could do it. So medicine and psychology, and this gets back to the APA, have become extraordinarily ideological. They're woke progressive ideologies now are running the education for our healthcare providers.
When you talk about that, and you talk about that people are asking for special benefits and things like that, that no longer goes on. Do you think we've reached a point where we have almost over accommodated to where now there's no going back on it now? We're going to have to accommodate everything. There is going to be no ranking, no anything like that. And the reason I ask that is because on the kind of end of that question is that going to at some point drain our systems, VA, medical, mental health? Is that going to drain our systems to where people that really need the help are not going to be able to get it?
It already is. And you're seeing good people in medicine, good doctors, good nurses, good clinicians of all stripes. Their morale is very low. They're not that different from where law enforcement is right now. They're being told, we no longer care about your expertise or the fact that you're the best. We're going to hire and promote on the basis of things that have nothing to do with merit. And that kills your morale right there. Your good people leave.
All right, let's get into this book. I want to get into this. I do have a bone to pick with you real quick. In the book, you talk about first responders and their syndrome, but you call it firefighter syndrome. I want to take can we maybe change a name? Can we get one put out there for police officers, law enforcement?
Yeah.
Can we get that? Because, firefighters, we run across them a lot, but come on,
Yeah. No, you're that's fair. That's completely fair. And I have an answer. And I have an answer for you on this. The firefighter syndrome came about because a career firefighter reached out to me about 4 years ago. And we just started talking and putting some stuff together and kind of mapping operator syndrome onto the experiences and injuries of firefighters. We've done that now with police. We just haven't published it yet. So that's in the works. And the idea of all of these approaches is that it boils down to a principle of the allostatic load which I can define for you in a moment if you like, that we put on many soldiers, law enforcement, firefighters, EMT, and other people in our society is so massive that we're going to see fairly predictable injuries and impairments. And we know this is true of law enforcement. So I will formally apologize to you for being behind the eight ball on this and acknowledge you're right. And we're working to correct that. We have a paper right now that is in a pretty advanced stage, and we just need to dot the I's and cross the T's and get it out there for publication.
And all joking aside, I know about the firefighter with you talking to him and stuff, but let's point out real things. Let's just talk about 2020, which was a crazy year, and we've gone back to it a couple times during this conversation. At that time, my wife was an ER nurse. She'd been an ER nurse for many years during it. But you look at law enforcement, firefighters, medics, ER nurses, ER doctors. Let's just take that group of people. When the world was told in the very beginning, hey, stay home, shelter in place, 6 feet, don't do this, don't do that. You guys, you're needed where you're at. You're going to come in every day. We don't care what we're saying. And my wife has told me she literally watched people die every day when we did not understand COVID, and we didn't, you see it every single day. They saw it every single day in the ER. Firefighters that were responding to calls, police officers that were just working the streets, answering calls at people's houses. The whole thing about that is we sped up exponentially in the lives of all of those actors, those characters, those jobs, this happening to them exponentially. I think we sped it up by 5 to 10 years just by that year, 2 years there. Can you talk to that and kind of how we have to approach that now? Because it's a completely different world now.
Man, I don't even know where to start with that. We responded to COVID in a manner that was completely dishonest and disingenuous. Let's start with that. There were political realities and conveniences for some, including administrators. We did not exercise common sense. We told ER nurses they were the heroes on the front lines. But what did we do to support them? What did we do to make their job, their life, any easier? Nothing. We did nothing for them. For people on the streets, law enforcement on the streets, what was happening in 2020? Mostly peaceful protests.
That's a whole different discussion we can have.
So I don't even know why you're complaining. They were mostly peaceful. No, but I'm being obviously absurd here. But as a society, we didn't care. I got mine. I was comfortable. I got whatever I needed. I got to stay home. A lot of people loved COVID because they didn't have to work. They didn't have to leave their home. They didn't have to do things that were otherwise going to be hard. They had Netflix. A lot of people believed a lot of what was being said. We never did, the first week of this, we didn't do what I thought we would do, which to me seems very obvious. I remember telling people, look, this is okay. We'll be okay. The CDC has almost certainly doing large-scale random medical behavioral surveillance approaches in large cities and small cities all over the country. So within 2 weeks, we'll know what the transmission rate is of COVID, and we'll know, within a few weeks after that, we'll know what the fatality rate is. All the numbers they told us about the fatality rates, of course, were not even close to being correct because they didn't do the randomized. They didn't sample people randomly. They just studied the people who came in as sick. And so if you only look at the people who are already having symptoms and coming into a hospital, that's a self-selecting population in the parlance of research speak. So we don't know. We never did the easy work of figuring out what the transmission rate and the lethality rate was. And then we came up with these things that everybody could see were just nonsense. The 6-foot rule. Where did that come from? Well, Fauci himself admitted they just plucked that out of thin air later. We were told don't wear masks because there weren't going to be enough masks. And then we were told, oh, you must wear masks. Early on, I went to the grocery store with a white hand towel tied around my face. I looked like I was probably with the 1880s Klan going into the grocery store. I mean, it was absurd. And we now know masks don't work. We know the masks did not protect. We knew that, and my care provider here in Hawaii is back to recommending masks. I said I was in the hospital in the clinic the other day to have some blood drawn, and they're all the nurses and the phlebotomists are all wearing masks. And I said, they got a big sign recommending but not requiring that patients wear masks. And I said, why are we back to this? Because the medical studies, peer-reviewed medical studies came out showing that masks were not helpful. And they all just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah, we just have to do what we're told. We don't have a choice or we lose our job. And we were lied to systematically over and over and over again in a way that as things, as time went on, then people stopped believing what we were being told. We weren't giving people the treatment that worked, and we were denying people treatments that we knew could work. And then we forced this vaccine mandate upon all of society, and we were told this will stop transmission. Well, it didn't. It will stop death. Well, maybe it reduced the percentage, the lethality a bit, but it didn't stop it. So the vaccines they didn't do what they were advertised as. I think I got off track from your point. So apologies.
No, I don't think you did. And here's why I bring that up. Why I say that we exponentially sped up that syndrome with first responders, ER, and personnel. Because I want to go back to the operator syndrome now. And I want to talk about from 2001 for almost 20 years, sustained combat. They saw more combat than ever. And there's no doubt in my mind, you exponentially sped it up for those guys too. And so I want to take those two. The reason I bring mine up first is because I know what happened during that. I can speak from my point of view on that. With you in writing this book, how much did we speed that up on the other side? Because I will tell you, in this book, you have some heavy hitters, guys that I know that wrote pieces in this book. And, their stories are amazing to hear in full scope how much this sped up for them for this combat, because a lot of them wanted to go to combat. They wanted to defend their country. And some of them even thought, hey, this is going to be over before I get into the fight. And then 20 years down the road, we see the effects that are coming off of it. Right.
I mean, there's no question of it. And we've done it as a society. All of us as a society, we've done this in a way that allows us not to see it. Most of us not to see it. Only 1% of people in America are veterans or know a veteran. I'm pretty sure the percentage is probably similar for law enforcement. Maybe it's lower for law enforcement. So let's say we have 97% of people in this country who don't know a veteran, don't know a first responder, don't know an ER nurse. These are just invisible people. They're hypothetical people that we don't think about until our house is on fire, or we've been mugged, or there are enemies washing up on our shores with guns. We don't think about it, and we've become a very complacent society in that sense. And so when you become complacent, it becomes easy to say things like, it becomes easy to vilify. You're a law enforcement? Well, that's toxic masculinity. As the APA, I denounce you as having toxic masculinity. Therefore, I've just dehumanized you. Now I don't actually have to treat you or help you. All the new psychologists I'm training, they're going to come to you with the ideology that their job is not to address your hormonal problems or whatever, your psychological problems, but rather to convert you to their perspective on things. The only way to help you is to turn you away from your masculinity and get you in touch with your feelings. And once you're in touch with your feelings, then we've had a success. But getting in touch with your feelings is going to mean you're really not going to be very you're not going to want to be a police officer anymore.
So let me ask you, from your standpoint of your life that you've spent in this career, when you say they don't think about you, you're an invisible person until they need you. And then when they need you and you do what you need to do, and then in the next breath, they're vilifying you.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk to what that does to the psyche of that person? And I want to hear it from a professional point of view, what it does to that psyche.
Well, you already know what it does to the psyche, so you should tell me. But I'll give you my best answer, and that is it's devastating. I'm risking my life to help strangers in my community every single day, and I'm paying a price for it. And what are they doing? Are they supporting me? No. They're mocking me. They're labeling me as a bad actor. They're they're accusing me of being an extremist, maybe a white supremacist, maybe a misogynistic, racist bigot. The actions I'm taking to protect people's lives, to keep them safe, I may have to take somebody in the street and I may have to put them in a hold or in handcuffs. I may have to arrest them. And once in a while, I may have to defend myself. But we're going to vilify that because that's not nice. Social workers could be solving these problems.
Let me ask you then, on the opposite, because I want to go back and forth between these two. How are you seeing it with the operators that are coming back? Because right now, I think we're at a point where a lot of people are behind their stories, are behind backing them as heroes. Do you see it ever going sideways on us? And let me give you an example. Vietnam was a very different war when they came back. They were treated very differently than what soldiers are now. But I could see with everything that we've been talking about tonight, that tide could turn on us very quickly.
You mean in a negative way?
Yes.
Oh, I think it's already with specific to veterans. I think that's already happening.
Okay. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, start with 99% of Americans don't know anything about the war or military or soldiers or military culture. They don't know what it meant to train. They don't know what it meant to deploy. They have stereotypical ideas from watching movies, and if they've even watched those movies. My undergraduate students, they're not, by the time they get to college, the kids coming into college now, they were born after 9/11. They don't really know what happened on 9/11. They're hearing over and over again that Hamas are the actual victims of the war, of the Hamas-Israeli conflict. They're thinking, they have a very different historical understanding, or I would say misunderstanding, of what's been going on for the past few generations, let alone the past few decades and millennia in that part of the world. So we start with a society that's both ignorant and disinterested. They don't care. They just don't even know. So when you have that, and then you're working with wrong information or just complete lack of information, it's only what you can imagine or what you've been told. I have some people on my campus, like some of the people that run the PR on my campus and some of the messaging and things like that, who are really big fans of my work and really make an effort. When I publish something or have a book or an accomplishment, they put it out there to the campus and they broadcast, it as and they do that for all faculty accomplishments in theory. But they've been really good with me. But my own colleagues at this small primarily undergraduate school, really, they're not really dialed in on my work, and they don't care. A few years ago, and I think it was maybe 4 years ago, might even have been 5 years ago, the chair of sociology here, who's since left, I think it was after that APA critique that you just read out loud, she denounced me on campus for my work with the military. And she did that by sending an email to the entire campus. Everybody on campus got her email. Ironically, I didn't get it because I refused to sign up for that particular listserv. So I'm probably the only person on campus that didn't receive this denunciation. But she said this faculty member is spending his time working on things related to toxic masculinity in the military, and we should all, come together and ask ourselves, is this the kind of faculty member we want on our campus? Now, it was mostly ignored. A couple of my colleagues spoke up and defended me publicly, but they were not faculty. They were people in student services or the upper administrative offices on campus at that time.
When we're talking about this, when we're talking about operator syndrome, when we're talking about firefighter syndrome and soon to be named law enforcement syndrome, when we're talking about all these things, I want to point out a specific thing in the book where you talk about that it is operator syndrome. It is very specific to special operators when you talk about that. And what I felt, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the beginning, you got a lot of kickback from that because they said, well, why are you just treating them and looking into their problems and not looking to big Army, big Navy, big Marine Corps? Why are you looking into that? I want you to explain, because I think you do it great in the book, about why it's so special to those names and why it has to stay special to those select groups.
Yeah. I wish I could remember what I wrote in the book, but I hope it's consistent with the answer I'll give you right here, which is the job of being a Green Beret or a SEAL or a PJ or a paramilitary for an intelligence agency or a private defense contractor. And by the way, it's not limited only to people with the formal, earned title of being an operator, but for the most part, operators, what they do is so different from what conventional forces do. Their mission sets are different. Their training is very different. The deployments are different, and they tend to have longer active careers of training and deployments, doing that. So what I mean by that is, and this is a hard thing for most people to understand, but the magnitude of difference in the allostatic load, and I keep using this phrase, which
well, let's go ahead and do a definition of it just so people completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna read it because this is not my definition. This is a definition that was formulated and written about in 1993. Two scientists named Ewan and Steller. They define allostatic load, and before I do the quote, this is a hypothetical. This is a theoretical construct of what is upon us, is what each of us carry, or is the load that it gets put upon each of us. So they define allostatic load as, quote, the strain on the body produced by repeated ups and downs of physiological response, as well as by the elevated activity of physiological systems under challenge, and the changes in metabolism and the impact of wear and tear on a number of organs and tissues that can predispose the organism to disease. So another way of saying this, and I'll speak maybe in just plain English here, is that this allostatic load is essentially everything that piles onto all of our physiological systems. So the nervous system, the endocrine system, the immune system, the musculoskeletal system, respiratory system, perceptual system, cardiovascular system, and there's other systems. And so we need to think about how all of these get affected together, because they're all affected simultaneously and they affect each other. So if you have a TBI, that's going to affect obviously your nervous system, but it's also going to affect your metabolic system. It's going to affect your lungs, your immune functioning, your cardiovascular functioning. And then there are the cascade effects. So you have these injuries, these impairments, they're going to bleed over and affect your relationships with your family, with your unit, with your colleagues, with your connection to all of society. So that's what allostatic load refers to. And that perspective on allostatic load says a couple of things. One is it means we need to pay attention to those who have more of it, and operators have more of it. And I'll come back to say a few things about that. But it also means we need to take this holistic perspective. which is very physiological. So to tell you, you have PTSD, here's some antidepressant medication and some sleep medication and some Ritalin or Adderall to help you get going in the afternoon. Those aren't addressing the holistic picture, and they're not addressing necessarily, almost certainly, root causes. So the allostatic load difference between a Green Beret and a conventional infantryman, let alone somebody who's not infantry. I mean, MOS of somebody who runs logistics and supplies. But let me just do conventional infantry. Let's say both are going to learn how to fire a rifle. The conventional infantryman is going to fire a certain number of rounds in training. The operator is going to fire that same number of rounds times 1,000, maybe. I mean, it's an order of magnitude more. They're diving, they're rucking, they're jumping out of airplanes, they're using training with shoulder-fired rockets, they're training as breachers and demolitions, tactical driving, the amount of combatives that they do. I ask guys how many times they've been choked out, and 5 or 6 is a fairly average number. So you put all that together, and it's massive. And now what we're appreciating is the role of blast exposures. Not that conventional forces don't get blast exposures, they certainly do. And so where I want to be careful here is to say, yes, there are conventional soldiers, people who are, kicking doors in urban combat, artillerymen, tankers, aviators. Many of them have, their own version of operator syndrome. They may not have I hate to use the word, but they may not have the dose of blasts that an operator has had, but they've had their, quite a bit of it as well. And that's the difference, is the magnitude, the order of magnitude difference of that allostatic load, especially with high operational tempo, blast exposures, and then all these other things that they do. And it isn't just about deployments, it's also about, because when they're not deploying, operators are working even harder. Operators love deployments because deployments are easy. Come home in the States, and that's when the training, it really kicks their ass.
Comparing both of these sides again, law enforcement and the operator side, we talk about people that have been in life or death situations or situations that would bring up that allostatic load and, they're up and down. Have you done any kind of research on showing, let's use police officers, for example, traffic stops, domestics, there's a bunch of different search warrants, all of those kind of things, high risk warrant execution. Have you done any kind of research that shows what that is doing? Because, they say like the average person has, 1 or 2 life or death situations in their whole life. And then you look at someone that's been a cop for 20, 25, 30 years, and it's exponentially larger. Have you done any research on that kind of stuff?
I have not directly done the research myself, no. What I would say is, even without going into the research, I think we can. And by the way, I want to say something about the amount of research that's been done on responders relative to veterans, because there's a huge differential there. For every published study in the medical literature on firefighters, there are 30 for veterans, 30 times more for veterans than for firefighters. For law enforcement, I think it's 5 or 7 times more for veterans. So there just simply is not the amount of medical research that's been done with responders. In a lot of ways, we simply don't know. We just don't know. We haven't done that. We haven't done the work.
With it being so large, the difference, is it because the war and the military was so in front of us for so long? Because I can't imagine pre 9/11 that there was that much research done. Is it because that was, and that's why the numbers are so askew? Or is it just that no one has thought to look into it?
I think it's because there is the VA that exists and the DoD exist. VA and DoD both fund a lot of research on their population, their people. There is no national body that has gazillions of dollars from the federal government to study the medical outcomes of responders. I think it kind of comes down in part to just simply that.
Money.
Money.
Yeah.
Money and the monolithic, federal government that by law and constitution have to support veterans. Federal government doesn't owe
And
quotas.
in the government's defense, I will say this, that it's a little different from military where you have, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. You have that kind of stuff, right? And then you go to a law enforcement or a firefighter and you have a department in every big city, every
Sure.
small city, every tiny city. I understand that you can't do that kind of stuff. There's just too much of it to cover down on everything. I completely understand that. A big thing that I would like to talk to you about before we end our conversation is if people don't understand this, if law enforcement doesn't understand it, maybe guys that were in special operations that don't understand or are not seeing the telltale signs. Can we talk about the telltale signs and where people should maybe take a pause, take a knee and go, okay, I'm starting to see this stuff happening to myself. I need to move in another direction.
Yeah. What are those signs and symptoms, in other words?
Yes.
Well, I don't have a simple answer for that, but in the book, in my operator syndrome book, there's a questionnaire in there that I think can be used by anybody. And you can go through this questionnaire and look at it. It provides the framework. So essentially, item number 1, how much are the insults on your brain? How much sleep disturbance are you having? How much hormonal dysregulation are you experiencing? How much chronic pain are you experiencing? So that's just kind of one simple way of thinking about approaching it. Now, many people won't have even the ability to necessarily know how to rate themselves on these things. I try to give some guidance in the book that would be relevant for responders as well as operators, as well as all combatants that have had high doses of head injuries and blast exposures. I mean, there are some things that I can recommend in there, that I do recommend in there. So, I mean, I would say that I wrote the book as a resource for you guys. I didn't write it for people with MDs and PhDs. It's written specifically as a practical guide for operators and soldiers and warriors and protectors, including responders. What do you look for? Well, I mean, are you drinking more than usual, or more than you used to? Or maybe you've always been drinking heavy. Is your drinking causing you problems? Another way just to say, are you having more than 2 or 3 drinks a night? That could be a level of concern. What is your sleep? What does your sleep look like? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you getting enough REM and slow wave sleep? So it's not just quantity, it's quality. And we have pretty good biometric wearables now. I use the Whoop, but the Fitbit, the Garmin, the Apple Watch, the Suunto, there's the Oura Ring. There's a bunch of these things out there. Track your sleep. Start paying attention. What do people who have known you for decades say? What does your wife think? Is she seeing a change? Wives and parents are pretty good at being able to say, you know what? My son, my husband, my partner is different, has changed. And the change is probably slightly gradual, so sometimes it's not noticed, as early on. Is anger a problem? Are you angry a lot of the time? What do you enjoy? Do you enjoy anything? The word anhedonia, which essentially means a lack of happiness, a lack of pleasure. Hedonia is the root word. Hedonism is pleasure, happiness. Put the word an in front of it and it means a lack of. If you're not enjoying things, especially things you used to enjoy or things you should enjoy, like time with family, time with children, grandchildren, those are markers. What are your energy levels? If you're experiencing low energy levels and you're a man, get your hormones checked if they're really low. Are you in a lot of pain? What hurts? That's I don't even ask guys anymore if they're in pain. I ask them where is the pain? Uh, and there are lifestyle things. We talked a little bit about treatment, but there are absolutely things that each of us can be doing to help improve our health, to help mitigate some of these injuries and impairments. Stop eating sugar. Stop putting fast food poison into your body. Eliminate fast food, sugar, junk food, chips, anything that's highly processed. Cut it out. Put an emphasis on sleep. Not sleep by having six Jack Daniels, but try to get to sleep naturally. Hot sauna bathing is super, super healthy for you. It reduces the inflammation in your body. Hot sauna bathing 3 times a week actually not only reduces the inflammation in your body, but it's a powerful antidepressant. They've shown that in randomized clinical trials. Or cold plunge, deliberate cold exposure. I did my cold plunge this morning. I do 3 days a week in water that's for about 39, 40 degrees. I set it at 37. My thing never quite gets down to that cold. But 5 minutes, 3 times a week, man, I sleep better. I feel better. I'm more alert. It's been a game changer for me.
Going through everything that we've talked about tonight, people realizing that it might be affecting them. I want to bring one more thing into it that we really haven't talked about. How important is the therapy portion of it? And I mean the therapy of talking to someone, art therapy, music therapy. How important is that in this whole process?
Let me separate the therapies you mentioned. Let me put psychotherapy on one list, and on the other bucket, let's put all the equine therapy, music therapy, art therapy. Those are things that I don't think are necessarily therapeutic in the traditional medical sense of things, but do those things because they help. I mean, we all feel better when we've gotten some time outside, when we've kissed a horse, when we listen to good music, when we make the time in our lives for activities with other creatures that can be gentle and we can love them with music. Hobbies, having a healthy hobby, fishing, walking, going on hikes outside. These are things that are powerfully beneficial to us, and they always have been, and we've always known this. We just kind of gotten away from understanding this in the modern world. Do you need to go to an equine therapist? I don't believe so. But if you like horses, go someplace and ride horses, or care for horses, volunteer someplace that has horses. On the psychotherapy side of things, so I've been a psychotherapist for 32 years now, since I got my degree. And I am a big believer in the value of psychotherapy. Talking to somebody who can understand you, who has a little experience with other people who may have some similarities to your struggles, to somebody who's humble, curious, and willing and ready to learn about you, and not just assume that because you're a cop, you're like every other cop they've ever known. Somebody who is at least a little bit scientifically literate, somebody who knows a thing or two about the nervous system. That can be incredibly powerful.
You won't find a bigger proponent of therapy than me. I think it's awesome to talk to an individual that has, I would even say, that has nothing to gain from the situation. I think that's the thing that I like the most about it. They have nothing to gain whether you go left or you go right on it, as long as they're listening. The thing I would ask you, though, is you point out a lot of things there. Someone who's scientifically inclined a little bit, someone who is curious. That's hard to find these days, because you're going to either a phone call where they're doing it over the phone, or you're just looking through kind of the yellow pages. Do you have some tips and tricks of people how they can find that right person for them?
Well, that's the catch here. So while I say psychotherapy is wildly beneficial when it's done right by the right kind of person for you, it's very hard to find that person. It's very hard to find that right person. And you would think, for a veteran, you would think it shouldn't be that hard. You'll go into a VA and every therapist in there knows how to work with veterans and knows what they're doing, but that's not the case. Unfortunately, too often, a pretty common thing that operators tell me is they fired every therapist they've ever talked to after one or two sessions, sometimes in the middle of a session. If you go in and talk to somebody who has no understanding of what you've been doing and doesn't pause to show the humility and the curiosity to say, it's one thing to say, I said this a lot early in my career. I never went to Vietnam. I was never a soldier, but I want to learn. You tell me, explain to me, share with me. And then part of it is knowing how to ask the right questions. Part of it is knowing how to have the right responses. If you come to me and you tell me about the worst experience you've had on the job, and my response is to go, oh my God, that's the worst thing. That's so horrible. And I start crying myself and I'm on the floor curled up in a little ball, you're going to get up and walk out. And, I know that sounds goofy, but that happens all the time. I've heard that story. That's exact version of that many times, over and over again, over the years. Therapists get freaked out by what a responder or a soldier has seen or done overseas. They're just not ready to even be able to hear it. And that's, then we're talking about therapy that's completely worthless. So it is hard. How you find that right therapist, I don't know. I think the only way you do it is you go by gut instinct. You do what little homework you can do on the individual therapist, and then you're ready to give them, the benefit of the doubt until they prove otherwise.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more that it could go sideways on you quickly. We got two more questions for you in this conversation. One, we've talked about it before. You talk to heavy hitters in this book. I mean, guys that have been there and done that. And I know a couple of the guys that were in the book, and their stories are amazing. When they tell you, and this has always been kind of very interesting to me, when they tell you these stories and you focus so much of your career on helping these guys get better, how much of a toll does it take on you?
I don't think it takes a toll on me.
Okay.
I'm not saying it doesn't affect me. I don't want to say it doesn't affect me, but I also don't want to say, oh, I've become harmed myself by listening to the things that other people have experienced. If you've experienced it, how can it be as powerful for me as it was for you?
Absolutely.
And so I don't want to, I don't accept that it's taken a toll on me. In fact, kind of the opposite. And I would say especially the last 10 years, well, the whole 32 years since I got my degree, I have loved my career. I have felt blessed and privileged and fortunate and just supremely honored to be able to have talked and worked with the men and women that I've worked with over the years. And that goes all the way back to my very first, time at the VA. And, the last 10 years has been, for me, I don't know any other way to say it. It's been it's made my life. I feel whole. I feel like I have had the honor and privilege to work with some of the very best people who ever lived. And, that's been my good fortune.
So let me ask you for the kind of final thing. How has this, talking to all of these people, doing this research, doing this book, how has it made you better?
I think I am more resilient to hardship, to loss, to stress. I think I have a very strong sense that I have done something meaningful and important with my life. If I die tomorrow, I'm okay with that because I feel like I've done something that mattered. I also, we talk about the epidemic of loneliness, especially of men. I don't have any loneliness. I have a lot of very, very good friends who are incredible people. So I feel like my life is very enriched and full by the people I know.
Well, I think you're doing amazing stuff. I think that, it started with this operator syndrome. It's transferred over into law enforcement. And I think that you are, if I can say, at the very front edge, the tip of the spear of making lives better for the first responders, for law enforcement, for firefighters, because of the dedication that you put into this. I cannot thank you personally enough for what you're doing with these books. I think that there's a lot of growth to happen in the law enforcement, first responder, medical community, from the research, from the studies that you're doing, from putting yourself out there and being vulnerable to take some of the hits that you've taken for the stances that you've taken in your career. And once again, it's a complete honor for me to meet you, to talk to you about this book and about this amazing thing that you're doing. I do want to point out and ask you, where can people find you if they want some more, if they want to find you on social media, if they want to find you Facebook, YouTube, anything like that, where they can find out more about you? And let's talk about the website a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I do have a website. It's being redesigned, so hopefully that will be relaunching in another month or two. I do have an Instagram account that for 6 months, I'd hired a really nice, really effective social media, some friends of mine who do that stuff. Now it's on me, and I haven't posted in a few weeks. So I'm not very active on Instagram. I'm not a social media person. The Big Island of Hawaii. You can find me on the Big Island if you know where to look. And I've got a lot of podcasts out there.
Well, it's funny when you say that they can find you there. I had to go through a guy that I knew that knew you, that had talked to you before. And I said, hey, remember when we talked about him? I can't really find his contact number and stuff. Do you think you can help me out? And he was like, yeah, I'll help take care of it. So I completely 100% agree with you. I had looked for a while and I'm like, I just cannot find out how to contact this guy and, kind of get in front of you. So I called them and I said, I know you know them. I know you know how to contact them. Can we make this happen? So once again, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Guys, you know where you can find Chris. Let's talk about where you can find me. As always, you can find me on social media at the DTD Podcast. Now, there's a couple different places you can find me. You can find me on Instagram at the DTD_podcast. You can find me on Facebook at the DTD Podcast. And you can find me on YouTube, where all these conversations, they're in video form. That's going to be at the DTD Podcast. But your one-stop shop, DTDpodcast.net. It's got audio, video, everything we're doing right now, everything we're going to be doing in the future. Chris will actually have his own episode page. It'll have all of his contact links. You can pick up the book there. Just go there and take a look. Find out a little more about him. It'll have a couple pictures. You know the normal deal. I'm telling you a little more about him. Just make sure you go there, dtdpodcast.net. Let me make sure that you guys know, too, for the show, making it happen. Be a friend. Tell a friend. Like, share, subscribe, do all those kind of things. It really helps out with the algorithm. Make sure you go check out our sponsors too. Max Belts, he makes the toughest leather belts on earth. And Trident Coffee. They make the best cold brew coffee in the world at tridentcoffee.com. DTD15 will get you 15% off your order. But make sure you go check out my boy Mac and you check out my guys at Trident. Guys, that's going to be it for this week. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments and we'll ask Chris at a later date. That's going to be it for this week. That's Chris. I'm DJ. This has been the show. Catch us on the next one. See you later.